Good evening, everyone, and welcome to WGBH. I am Sita Pai, the Executive Director of Education here at WGBH, and I'm honored to be here among all of you, our area's best, most innovative educators, especially during Teacher Appreciation Week. As an educational foundation, WGBH knows the importance of convening educators like yourselves to address our community's greatest challenges and support each and every one of the students in your classrooms. Hats off to the Boston Foundation for recognizing your expertise and celebrating teacher-led innovation. The Boston Foundation has long been a friend to WGBH, and we are delighted to have you in the building. I hope you have a wonderful and inspiring evening together. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. All right. Hello, my name is Orlando Watkins. I am the Vice President for Programs at the Boston Foundation. I have a very simple job this evening. It's to welcome you to the 7th Annual Boston EdTalks. Thank you all for being here and for being part of this very important event for us. It's been an incredible 7 years, the Boston Foundation sponsoring and supporting this. We are deeply grateful to WGBH for hosting us here in this amazing space and allowing us to add really high quality production to this incredible event. So thank you, WGBH. Many of you are probably familiar with the work of the Boston Foundation, but for those of you who might not be, the Boston Foundation is the Greater Boston's community foundation. We're one of the largest and oldest community foundations in the country. We have assets of roughly $1.2 billion. Last year, we made about a $130 million grant in partnership with our incredible donors. In addition to our grant making and work we do with our donors, we act as a civic leader by convening leaders across multiple sectors, also by collaborating with researchers and think tanks to analyze problems, inform the public, and evaluate progress towards a thriving community. These Boston Ed Talks are made possible in part to our partnership with WGBH, certainly the Boston Foundation, but also through a generous grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has enabled us to host this event at WGBH and support the work of Teach Plus, Boston edX Fellows Program. These programs are really a channel through which the Boston Foundation's education strategy has worked to elevate the very important teacher voice that you will hear tonight. To tell you more about this work, I'd like to welcome to the stage my amazing, incredible, dynamic colleague, Elizabeth Pauley, who serves as the Associate Vice President for Education to Careers at the Boston Foundation. And as Elizabeth comes up, and you can give her an applause, she certainly deserves it. I'd like to also thank my amazing education team at the Boston Foundation who put a lot of work into making this event happen. So please give them a round of applause as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Orlando, and let me add my welcome to Orlando's. Welcome to the 7th Annual Boston Ed Talks. This is my favorite event of the year, and I'm so happy to see so many of you, friends, teachers, colleagues, regular Ed Talks attenders, and newcomers. So welcome. We believe that this celebration of Teacher Appreciation Week is the largest celebration in Greater Boston, and the Boston Foundation is delighted to partner with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and WGBH to make it even bigger this year. So welcome. As Orlando mentioned, at the Boston Foundation, education is one of our highest priorities. It's one of the primary ways in which we work to connect residents of our city and region to the opportunities afforded by our region. And in our work, we strive to support the creation of the conditions for success that will ensure that every student is prepared to succeed in their career and in our neighborhoods and as our colleagues and friends here in our city and region. One way that we endeavor to create those conditions for success for students is by listening to those who are closest to the work, and tonight's celebration is in service to that. It won't be a surprise to anyone in this room to know that the Ed Talks was a teacher's idea. Every year, we have worked to elevate innovative, inspiring teachers through this event because a brave group of teachers raises their hand every fall and they apply with an idea that they have. The members of the Boston Foundation's Teacher Advisory Board, who are representatives from Boston's district, charter, and Catholic schools, review their applications and actually audition them, and then have the very hard choice of selecting a small slate of presenters. And it is always extremely competitive because, as you know, as fans of teachers in this room, there are so many good ideas and so much good work happening in classrooms and schools around the city and region. I'd like to take a moment to thank the members of the Teacher Advisory Board for their work to make tonight a success, but also their advice and counsel over the years to the Boston Foundation. So if you are a member of the Boston Foundation's Teacher Advisory Board, would you please stand up so we can thank you? Thank you. And while I'm thanking people, I would like to broaden my thanks to all of the teachers who are here. This is Teacher Appreciation Week, and so tonight we appreciate you. But we do not only appreciate teachers during 1 week in May. That is a full-time, year-round job. So please join me. If there are teachers in the room, if you identify as a teacher, you have a purple tag on your name tag, would you please stand up so that we may give you a round of applause? Thank you for all you do every day. And as I said, tonight is not the only night we should be thanking you, but tonight is the night that we endeavor to spread the word about the inspiring and innovative work that you do and the work that's happening in schools in our city and region. So now here's where everyone in the audience comes in with the ask that I have for you. Tonight's purpose is spreading the word about inspiring and innovative teaching. So my ask to you is that you turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself if you don't know them, and take a selfie with them. Once you have a picture that you like, I urge you to tweet that picture, post it on Instagram, post it on Facebook, using the hashtag Boston EdTalks. So if you could take a moment now to take your selfie and harness the power of social media. So please harness the power of social media for good tonight. Use hashtag Boston EdTalks. It is on your program. Please help us spread the word. If you hear something that inspires you, surprises you, that is really an innovative idea that you hadn't heard before, please share that tonight so we can help to spread the word. And so with that, I am now going to turn the stage over to the teachers. And to do so, I'll invite our MC up to the podium. Our MC is not only an Ed Talks alumna, she is also the 2017 National Teacher of the Year and a 9th grade teacher at Codman Academy in Dorchester, Sydney Chaffee.
Good evening, everyone. So, thank you. So you may or may not have heard, it's actually Teacher Appreciation Week. And so this always makes people think about, okay, well, what do teachers want, right? Like, do they want a gift card to Target? Yes. Do they want, like, wine and time on the couch? Yes. But more than that, there's more than that we want. So my job this year as National Teacher of the Year, I've been on sabbatical from my school, and I've been traveling all over the country and actually all over the world to talk to people about what teachers do and why this work of teaching is so magical. And I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of different kinds of audiences. But I got this one invitation to go speak to a group of policymakers. Okay, so these are folks who don't work in the classroom every day, but they do make all kinds of decisions on the kinds of rules and regulations that trickle down into our classrooms. So I was really intimidated to talk to this group of people, and I didn't quite know how to talk to them because my normal, like, corny jokes weren't gonna work with them. So I hit Twitter, as all good educators do, and I asked all of the teachers I know on Twitter, what do you want policymakers to know? And I got all kinds of answers, but the one that stuck with me most came from a college friend of mine. He teaches in Texas, and his answer was 2 words long. He said the message that he wanted policymakers to hear was, trust me. And there were actually a lot of other teachers who echoed that, right? But like more verbose. So I went to these policymakers and I gave a speech and I basically said to them, hey, trust teachers. So in thinking about Teacher Appreciation Week, I was thinking about that theme. Well, what do teachers want? How do we actually celebrate teachers? And I want to challenge you tonight to do more than just celebrate all of these amazing teachers who are going to be up here on this stage. I want to ask you to actually elevate them to the position of experts and professionals in our community who know what the answers are for the issues that plague us in education. So I'm going to ask you as you listen to these speakers tonight to really look at them and their ideas through that lens of trust, to open your minds and your hearts to their ideas and to see them as the people who really know what's best in our schools. So on that note, I want to get us started. I'm excited to introduce our first 2 presenters, and I'm just going to say before I get started that a lot of these teachers are very accomplished and have very long titles, so I'm going to do my very best to get their titles right, but if I have to look at my note cards, forgive me. All right, so I'm excited to introduce Sharon Lozada. She's a STARS peer leadership teacher at Cambridge Ringe and Latin School, and Angeline Weeham, who is a district design and innovation coach with the Cambridge Public Schools. Right? Thank you. And they're going to talk to you about how to get your mojo back when you're seeking innovative solutions to everyday challenges. So welcome them up to the stage.
Let's face it, for anyone who's in education right now, it can feel pretty overwhelming. There's a lot to navigate. It's like a maze, like an obstacle course to maneuver. Whether we're dealing with likes and swipes, staying on top of all the emails and the tech updates, taking care of everyone else's needs, including our own, or trying to actually find what we're looking for in all of this, right? Whether we're trying to stay up with a slew of initiatives like ABCs, DDMs, MCAS, XYZs, it can all make us feel like we want to go MIA. So in this era of evaluation, something big is missing. It's like we lost our spark, our mojo. And did we lose it? Or did we actually just give it away? Even if we wanted to find it, it's not like we have the time to look for it anyway. We're all caught up in this push and pull between obligation and inspiration. All this focus on what we have to do is holding us back from what we really want to do.
What we want to do. What if we focused on that? In the fall of 2014, I was having my own lost mojo moment. So I did something I never imagined myself doing. I went to business school. I thought I'd be a fish out of water, but something about that experience brought me back to the things I had been longing to get back to, following my curiosity, leaning into the things that inspired me, and trusting my decisions. And when I went back to the Cambridge Public Schools, I was eager to hear how things were different, but disappointed to see that although the seasons had changed, not much else had. Educators still wanted their voices to be heard, and they wanted to innovate solutions to problems they were seeing. But often, obligation was prioritized over inspiration. I wondered, what if we flipped that scenario and found our way back to being inspired, curious decision makers? We're here tonight to say that we don't believe that obligation and inspiration have to be separate. Inspiration is what makes obligation bearable, because it is a lot easier to do what you have to do when you want to do it. So in the fall of 2016, I offered an opportunity to educators, and I called it the Design Lab. It was a place for educators to gather, and it was really rooted in design thinking. Design thinking is creative problem solving. It's human-centered, it's collaborative, it's optimistic, and it's experimental. Design thinking begins by reframing a challenge. For example, recognizing the loss of educators' mojo and asking ourselves, how might we capitalize on educators' expertise and experience and passions to change the way in which problems are addressed? There are 4 other phases that we move into: the eyes and ears, the head, the hands, and the heart. The eyes and ears are about awareness and learning. By being aware of our biases, identity, power, and context, and learning as much as we can about the experiences of others through observations and interviews, we're already data rich. From that information, we move into the head, and we make sense of it. We interpret it, and then we start to brainstorm as many ideas as possible. Then we move to the hands, and that's where the magic happens. We get out of our heads and start doing things in real time, prototyping them in classrooms, in after schools, and in the community. And then, what happens next, Sharon?
So just as the student design lab was hatching, I was walking into my classroom every day to a challenge that just kept presenting itself to me. I thought I was doing everything I could to engage my students in real and relevant ways. They didn't necessarily agree. Sure, sometimes there'd be moments of interest, but let's be real. Sometimes they just weren't feeling it. So I would go home and do some soul searching around what cool activity I could come up with to re-engage them, or what magic trick I could pull out of nowhere. And I kept asking myself, what's wrong? Why aren't they feeling it? I was starting to feel like I was losing my mojo too. And then I thought, no way, I'm not having it. I knew I didn't want to be feeling this way, and neither did my students. We just had to get out of this funk. So I invited myself and them to do something that none of us had done in a long while. Play with ideas, with what we feel passionately about, with what we wanted our learning and our lives to look like. And we thought, where else could we do this beyond the classroom? That's right, the design lab. So we signed up and we got to work. But it wasn't work as we were conditioned to know it. We dove into the design thinking process, and we tried to figure out how to reignite what was missing for us. We told our stories. We asked real questions of real people. We mapped out wild ideas. We experimented with prototypes. And we made mistakes, and we learned from them and each other. And in doing this, my students inspired me to become a student again. And they became my teacher. And through this, we were able to claim our own design challenge. And with the key elements of voice, choice, and agency. See, this is how it works.
This is how it works.
This is design thinking on the spot.
Prototyping with our hair.
With the key elements of voice, choice, and agency, we created our own student design lab, or student D-lab to, keep it hip. And this was a place where students could take on the issues that really matter to them and make meaningful change in their own community. So now we've taken the design lab multiple times. In the grand scheme of education, it's not usually a good thing if you have to take something over again. But the D-lab is different. We just can't get enough of it. The creative, collaborative vibe, the dynamic energy, the chance to take on risks and to change up the status quo with students and teachers. In the D-Lab, we can turn learning on its head and crack it wide open. And as a result, we all feel so much better.
So you're probably imagining the lab, right? Whiteboards, dry erase markers everywhere, movable furniture, even a snack station. That's what it's like in Silicon Valley, right? And don't we deserve the same?
Yep.
But here's the catch. There is no lab. There is no lab. It's not a space. It's space and a mindset to exhale, reset, prioritize, connect, and build in ways that we haven't had. And it's in that simplicity that new ideas are launched. Because with limited funds and limited space, people get creative. And when educators get creative, a non-traditional network is formed. And when you combine a determined group of people and an opportunity, it feeds something that obligation can't, and only inspiration can. So, the Design Lab has grown from 5 educators to over 300 participants and is a new model to co-design in our schools, district, and in our community. And design challenges range from kindergartners designing centers for their peers to the dismantling of 7th grade tracking and providing advanced math for all scholars, to new and exciting ways to engage high schoolers beyond the school day. And it's not perfect. It is definitely not perfect. But let me tell you, something has begun. And we not only own it, embrace it, but we're moving this work forward.
And so now we're all in this together. And we keep taking on our design challenges and turning to each other to try to solve them. We now have administrators, teachers, students, community partners, all turning to each other to bravely face and reframe our problems and play with the possibilities in a space that's bigger than we ever imagined. And now this space belongs to all of you too. So let's try this right now, together. Ask yourselves, what keeps you up at night? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What inspires you? Because if we follow that inspiration, it will lead us to our very own design challenges. And when you leave here, don't stop. Commit to your challenge and share it out to make it real. Seek out your tribe and invite them into your journey. Then dive deeply. When we give ourselves this permission to experiment and play, we all can embrace what is truly ours. And in doing so, we will find that elusive mojo that we've been searching for all along. Thank you.
Next up, please welcome Robert Camo. He's an English, not yet. I have to give you his credentials so you know he's legit. All right, he's an English teacher at another Course to College in Boston. And he believes in the power of reflective writing to bring out the best in our students, but also in ourselves. Now you can clap for him.
I once taught a young man named Truth. I had him in a study where he'd do anything but study. I thought I knew Truth. I thought he was one of those kids who came to class, put his head down on the desk, and failed classes, head to summer school. I thought I'd seen him before, until I gave him a chance to write his own story down in his own words. I gave him a book called Know Thyself that I created for reflective writing for students to foster student and teacher change. When I gave him a chance to write down his own story, he wrote to me that every summer he volunteered in an emergency room in an inner city hospital, bringing life and hope and health to people who needed it. He taught me his truth. And one of his classmates, who I thought was a kid who was disengaged, taught me he was a leader in his crew. That when he went home to his neighborhood, he called the shots. And sure enough, once he told me that, I saw the truth. When he leaned into class discussion, his peers leaned in. And when he sat back, they sat back. These young people can teach us the truth, and the truth can set us free. Now, teachers and students can work together to break the cycle of failure when they get stuck. Everyone knows at least one kid whose life has been changed by a teacher. Ask any teacher and they'll tell you how much they've learned from their students. In the best classrooms, teachers can learn and students can teach. But what happens when that symbiosis breaks down? And some students fail and their teachers fail to reach them. Now, student support teams work hard to help struggling students, but there are so many. And the interventions there tend not to reach back to affect classroom practices. Often we ask students to leave their whole selves outside of the door and get with a program we set up before we met them. In the best classrooms, there's a healthy flow of knowledge and power between students and teachers, but that flow can get choked by forces that are hard to see for reasons that are hard to say. I know I was one of those kids who went to high school, put his head down on the desk. By junior year, I was failing classes. By senior year, I dropped out. I joined the Marine Corps. But in 4 years, when I got out, I went back to the same dead-end jobs I had when I left. It wasn't until I started community college, where they taught me how to write my own story, that I broke my own cycle of failure. I wrote about my life, my work. I wrote about the wet rot of a garbage truck run and the arid wasteland of the incinerator. I wrote about the mechanical grind of the acid bath and the acrid fumes of the acid bath and the mechanical grind of the steel factory. I wrote about the dull toil of the furniture warehouse, which was broken up by the surreal oasis of the showroom, a little island of middle-class tranquility where you'd see a classy dining set, a cozy bedroom, all posed and phony, but that still left you longing. Writing transformed me. It helped me go from high school dropout to Harvard grad school. It has transformed my students. Research shows that when we give kids the chance to write expressively, it helps them vent stress that clouds thinking. It reveals trauma that needs healing. It can help them develop a counter-narrative to the stories we assume about them, and then they can internalize and tell about themselves. I remember a group of kids came in, two of them put their heads down right away, but they lifted them up to write. One young man wrote about being exhausted because he was watching Netflix all night. That's one kind of conversation. But that conversation revealed some insomnia that he needed a connection to the school nurse for. His classmate, a young woman, wrote for 3 pages about discovering her brother the night before on the front steps suffering from stab wounds. And she had spent all night in the emergency room with him. That's a very different conversation. But a teacher can assume both of these kids are disengaged, maybe they don't care, but give them a chance to tell their story and they'll tell it. And it'll help create a counter-narrative for themselves and for their teachers. When we're stuck in a cycle, we can't see our way out alone. I remember teaching a fellow who was disengaged. He had been suspended for fighting, searched for drugs. He was failing classes. He wrote in his journal, "I'm not the thug they think I am." It was the seeds of a counter-narrative and answered back to the racist discourse he felt himself under. When it came time to write his college essay, he wrote about being a kid who was happy, having a nice life, all the toys he wanted from the TV commercials, and a mother who seemed magic to him, popped meals right out of the microwave. Until one day the boys in blue came without a knock, and that magic mother disappeared. He wrote in his journal, "I didn't know who would take care of me or where I would live." And that's where his story froze. And that, in my experience, having done this for 7 years with kids now, it's very typical of a student who has suffered trauma that their own narrative tends to freeze at that crisis point, because at some level they're still there. But research shows you can help people resolve that story and heal. And I worked for weeks with that young man to try to help him finish that story. And nothing worked until one day I asked him, "What about your grandma?" And he smiled wide. And he finished the story. He started writing about this heroic figure and an old woman who came in like a superhero with home-cooked meals. The trafficking was gone. He watched her come home from work and go back, and she made sure he got to school and came home. But he closed his story this way. I want to do something my mother nor my grandmother has ever done, and that is to go to college. I'd never heard this from him before, and I don't think he'd said it to himself. But he imagined it, he wrote it down, and he made it happen. Today, that young man is a graduate of a post-secondary educational program. He wrote himself there. Educators, ask your students to write down their stories and help coach them from crisis to resolution. Ask them to write down their strengths and help them reason through negative self-talk. Ask them to write down their goals and help them plan small steps to reach them. If you give your kids the chance to write expressively, narratively, they will reauthor their own story, rewrite your understanding of them, and help you transform your teaching. Know thyself, teachers and students, and we'll better learn together. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Simone Miles Estevez, teaches history and is an advisor to the Director of Multicultural Services at Buckingham Browne and Nichols School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Simone wants us all to become deep thinkers about thinking itself so that we can better understand both our histories and our identities.
So if you're anything like me, you probably have theme songs for your thinking. I happen to have several, but one of them is The Greatest Love of All by Whitney Houston. I hear that song and I hear myself thinking, that is exactly why I teach. These children are the future. And my dreams for them don't stop with astrophysicist or master of the trades or artist who captures both the best and unfortunately the worst of humanity. I teach because I believe that their mastery and proficiency will make the world a better and more humane place. Like Kendrick Lamar. Last month, Kendrick Lamar won a Pulitzer Prize. His former teachers, I'm certain, are not sitting around going, okay, whatever, Pulitzer Prize, whatever. No one is thinking that. Those teachers cannot be thinking anything less than, what an accomplishment. And how will this man who was once a boy in my class continue to grow? How will he continue to impact the world? And that is why we teach. Because we know that the kids we teach today will be the caretakers and the decision makers for tomorrow. And so in preparation for those roles, we use tools like character education and service projects and diversified texts and our own goals of culturally proficient teaching. Because we know, like Aloe Black once said, that to change the world, you gotta change your mind. You can't keep on living on the wrong side of the same design. So we use those tools and encourage empathy, hoping that children become adults who will use it to make the world a better place. But isn't that a little bit risky? Encouraging empathy and hoping that kids maximize it? Proficiency doesn't happen with hope. Proficiency comes with intention. And we can be intentional about teaching empathy by first turning our attention on our conscious awareness to who we are and how we teach before we assess the world. That's how we'll get kids to become more empathetic people. And I know what you're thinking. Okay, so if I have a conscious awareness of myself, that's gonna help me and my kids to become more empathetic. How cliche. It's actually a little cliche, but it is true. But it's true. A great example of this is my charter school years. Before I realized that metacognition was essential to my practice, I sort of stumbled into my metacognition and followed it down the path to some of the most important lessons I'd ever taught. In my charter years, my students were predominantly Black and brown, and they hailed from all corners of the diaspora, but many of them came from the Caribbean. And don't let these kids get to representing their Caribbean pride because there would be no more lesson. And I heard some people over here hollering, so I need to ask, where are my Honduranians at? Okay, woots woots. But that being said, it's interesting that there was all this pride from my kids from across the diaspora, but there was a nuance with my kids from Haiti. When my Haitian kids, okay, I see you. When my Haitian kids got to represent their pride, there seemed to be some sort of unspoken joke, and it just felt wrong. My inclination as a teacher was to close ranks and remind kids of our values, among which were courage and respect. But I've been doing this thing a little while, and I knew that that wouldn't work. Haitian kids would just be laughed at out of range and in covert ways. The problem wouldn't go away. So I had to think to myself, are these kids just mean? Or are these sweet babies living legacies of the colonized mind as explained by Frantz Fanon? And conscious awareness of my own thinking led me to take a look at my curriculum and find places where I could call their attention to what they were doing and have them unpack their own thoughts. In subsequent lessons about Haiti's revolution and independence movements, I learned that many students had no idea that Haiti was the first Black republic. They didn't know that Haiti was a country founded by formerly enslaved people who just stopped asking for freedom and they took it. Many of my kids were like, okay, that's impressive, but if Haiti is so great, why are they struggling? Enter lessons on embargoes and blockades and loans with exorbitant interest rates. Enter lessons on systematic and historic oppression. Over time, the Haitian jokes seem to decrease because there's intellect behind humor. And when a joke is confronted by what you know to be true, it just isn't funny anymore. I even noticed that my non-Haitian students would be schooling other comedians who didn't really understand what they were making fun of. In that particular lesson, or those particular lessons, I allowed metacognition to take me down a path to a lesson that I needed to be teaching, but so many other times I didn't. So many other times I treated misinformation as a mistake that needed to be fixed as opposed to an opportunity to teach, and I missed the mark. But the future that we're hoping these kids develop cannot afford for us to squander those lessons. Metacognition is also an opportunity for us to be reflective. A couple of years after my time in charter schools, I found myself teaching in independent schools. It wasn't something I had ever considered for myself. And while that first year wasn't the most challenging experience I had, it definitely wasn't the easiest. The things that made me great or made me feel good about my charter practice didn't exist in this place, and it began to take a toll on me. At some point, I told my husband, I'm just gonna look for other opportunities next year. And being supportive of whatever I do, he just curiously asked, well, why? What made you great before? And I told him that my strength as a teacher comes from the relationships that I'm able to build with the tough kids, but that there were no tough kids in this place, and I just didn't know how to teach there. Well, why would I have ever said that? His response to me was, don't do that. Don't act like there are only tough kids in our communities. There are tough kids at that school. They might look different, they might move differently, but they're there. So go back next year, find your tribe, and be great at what you do. And if that doesn't work, maybe look for another opportunity the following year. And of course, my response to him was, well, first of all, who are you talking to like that? Number one. But you're absolutely right. That's exactly what I'll do. And that's what I did. I went back. And wouldn't you know it, two kids who weren't necessarily the most magnetic to some teachers were drawn to some element of what I was doing in the classroom. And because they were drawn to what I was doing, other kids followed. And you all know the cosign from kids is real, right? So, because I could bring my authentic self to my practice, I started to feel good about teaching again. Interestingly, if I hadn't gotten that great advice, I wouldn't have realized that I wasn't being metacognitive. I wasn't allowing myself to just experience a transition and deal with the bumps that come in the road. I wouldn't have realized that I was putting my charter students, my independent school students, and myself into boxes that flatten the experiences of us all. We have to know our assumptions instead of saying that we should not have assumptions so that we can be reflective and so that we can continue to grow in that way and so that we can continue to be the best practitioners that we can be. When we can make metacognition intentional, that's when the magic really happens. In the beginning of the year in my 8th grade class, we take a look at the enclosure movement, which deals with sort of displaced laborers in England. And some of those laborers are referred to as beggars. That language in some of those primary sources bothers me because I know that that's a loaded language and I know it won't come up if I don't actually mention it. So prior to the lesson, I put the word beggar on the board and I asked kids, what comes to mind when they see this word? And not a lot of kids raise their hand. And when I say not a lot of kids, I mean no kids actually raise their hands, right? No one is responding to this. And I think you all probably know why kids were not responding to this. Because we've all been taught that if you have nothing nice to say, you say nothing at all, right? But what good is knowledge if we leave subconscious thoughts undisturbed and unquestioned? Then we learn the right things to say, even if we don't believe them, and our actions and our values follow suit. So in the example of the word beggar, I had to give a couple of examples. Well, some of us might see this word and we might think a person that this word applies to is unsafe. We might think a person that this word applies to is not willing to work hard. And after I gave a couple of examples, kids started to fill the board with their ideas. Slowly, but they did, okay? And towards the end of that lesson, I realized that kids need to be encouraged to get uncomfortable with their own thoughts. That particular lesson was very challenging for them because it was the first time they did it, but it wasn't the last, and they get better at it over time. We'll get better with metacognition over time. We'll get better with thinking about our own thinking over time. Practice doesn't always make perfect, but it often makes better. Students will practice metacognition, and they will continue becoming better iterations of themselves who will make the world a better place. Teachers will practice metacognition, and they will continue becoming better iterations of themselves and better iterations of their teacher self. That's how we make the world a better place. Thank you.
Jennifer Glynn. Jennifer Glynn is a 4th grade teacher at Match Community Day School, and James Likas is a former teacher and a data inquiry facilitator for the Boston Public Schools. Jennifer and James truly embody teacher leadership. They've developed a program to transform instruction by empowering the true experts on what happens in classrooms, teachers themselves.
Every time a student enters a classroom, they deserve the best. A community that values and inspires them. A teacher who cares for them and holds really high expectations. And the opportunity to achieve at levels they didn't even know that they were capable of.
Sadly, though, this just isn't the case. And it's not a question of if teachers want it to be the case, it's a question of what we're doing to get there. In America, we seem to believe that great teachers are just born, when in reality, anyone can become a great teacher if they have the appropriate supports and tools for improvement. So, it's not that we've ever had in America a teacher problem, as all the lovely teachers in the audience know, is that we have an improvement problem. So let's dig into improvement for a second. How does anyone get better at anything? Well, you got to try it, right? You need to pause, you need to reflect, you need to name some next steps, and then you need to go back and practice to move yourself forward. This is true for 4th graders in Jen's class learning how to add and subtract fractions, all the way up to AP Biology students learning about the intricacies of photosynthesis. And the exact same thing holds true for teachers in classrooms. Teachers are teaching every day. They need to be observed. They need the opportunity to pause and reflect, get some feedback, and name next steps about how they're going to move their instruction forward. And then they need to get the chance to practice. Now, students have teachers to guide them in this learning and provide them with this feedback. And teachers are often relying on either an instructional coach or another administrator in the building to support them in this process. When teachers receive this thoughtful coaching, amazing things happen. When you get feedback on a specific element of your instruction, you're able to move it forward. And as you see improvement, your confidence will grow. And as your confidence grows, then you're more likely to target something else even more challenging in your practice to continue to move it forward for the students that you serve. Across the city of Boston, we see that schools that have higher rates of instructional coaching also have higher outcomes for students. And test scores are definitely not everything, certainly not advocating that. But High test scores are often the outcome of a rigorous and supportive classroom environment, and that's the kind of place we want for all of our children.
So if we know that this is what works, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that across the city of Boston and across our country, teachers are coached and given feedback at disproportionate rates. In fact, the average teacher in the city of Boston reports just 5 observations per year. And most of these observations are done for evaluative purposes, not to share feedback to help their instruction grow and therefore increase student outcomes. No, and the coaching that does happen often is targeted to the newest teachers, and the feedback they're receiving has to do with classroom management skills, whereas the more veteran or expert teachers are just left to figure it out on their own. Now, ideally, every school would have an instructional coach, but there are some complications that arise there too. First, instructional coaches are members of the administrative team, and therefore being pulled in 1,000 different directions every minute of the day. Their time spent in classrooms is decreased as they attend to things like being the nurse and helping with buses and calling parents. Maybe you have an instructional coach who makes the time to be in your classroom. Wonderful. Still have some issues. You have this content specificity that just can't quite be met. Maybe you were an excellent 6th grade literacy teacher for much of your career, now coaching 2nd grade math. Not terrible, but definitely not great. This problem becomes exacerbated in the upper grades as content becomes more and more specific. You can't tell someone to, reinforce expectations as they're trying to teach the finer points of William Shakespeare's craft moves in all of his plays. No, you need specific coaching from someone who understands your curriculum. The heart of all of this is that schools are stressed systems. Time is short, money is short, staffing is short, and therefore these things are allocated in more reactionary moves as opposed to proactive. Things like coaching are cut to the wayside.
So what are our options? Well, we could push to get an instructional coach into every single school, but I think we all know that schools aren't flush with cash, so it's not like that's just laying around. Or we could just keep our fingers crossed, really believe that we're going to do a better job with coaching teachers, and just see where it takes us. This is where do-it-yourself or DIY coaching comes in. Jen and I believe the solution to this problem is to fundamentally reimagine the role of coaching for classroom teachers, from something that's done only by an outsider to something teachers can do for themselves and one another through a very simple but very powerful tool, video. So how's this work? Teacher goes into their classroom, pull out their smartphone, set it up in the back, press record. What they're doing in this moment is they are creating a video of their instruction, seeing exactly what an outsider would see. After their lesson's over, with all the extra free time that they have, they find some time to sit down, watch that video back, and reflect on their practice. Here, they're not relying on somebody else to tell them what they need to change in their instruction. They're the ones looking and seeing what's going on in their classroom, targeting areas of improvement in their instruction to figure out what they need to do to best meet the needs of their students. From there, they're back, teaching again, videotaping again, and engaging in this cycle of continuous improvement. That is DIY coaching in a nutshell. But we built out a little bit more support through our year-long model. For the first third of the year, teachers are getting comfortable with the extremely uncomfortable act of watching themselves on video. In addition to that, they're doing some reading to improve their coaching capacity and their instructional leadership capacity. About a third of the way through the year, we make a little bit of a pivot. Teachers are still watching themselves twice a month, uncomfortable and all, but they're now engaging in peer-to-peer coaching conversations as well. Now, as the presenting teacher in that situation, I'm going to watch my video. I know what I want to do to improve, and so I'm going to tell my colleagues to watch my video with that same lens. We're going to get together for a coaching conversation, and at the end of that, I'm going to be the one naming my next steps. Because again, I'm the leader in my classroom. I know my students, I know my instruction, I know what I want to improve, and I know what my kids need. Two important things about this model. First, teachers are coming together in content-specific cohorts. So this is a group of math teachers all focused on their math instruction. Now, what this coaching is allowing them to do is to develop their pedagogical content knowledge. Very buzzwordy, but this is what that means. There's a difference between teaching math at a really high level and teaching English language arts at a really high level. So this is the type of coaching that's going to allow folks to focus on the particular moves that are going to move their students forward in their particular content area. Second thing, again, teachers are professionals. They know what their kids need. They know what they need. And so this is allowing them to drive the change in their instruction.
You might be asking yourself, what if teachers pick the wrong thing to work on? Or what if their next steps don't make the most sense? Will they even have time to do this? James and I firmly believe that teachers are experts in their classroom, in their community, and in their students. They know what's working and they know what's not. And they have creative solutions to implement to try to change things around. By watching this, we're helping teachers to illuminate what's going on in their classroom. They try out some strategies. Some don't work, some do, and it feels good when things are starting to move in a direction that you want. In this process, teachers will begin to feel encouraged and invested in their own strength as an instructional coach for themselves, and therefore make the time to do this. So ultimately, it doesn't matter what teachers are working on, so long as they're doing this and building their skill. We already have evidence of this change in action. Last spring, we piloted a DIY coaching with 8 math teachers, ranging from kindergarten through 12th grade. And this past fall, we launched a much larger version of the program. We're excited to share that we now have 28 teachers representing 22 schools across Boston who are engaging in this work, which is impacting 1,600 students each and every day. Yeah, it's pretty great. Now, while DIY coaching does cost money, we know that there's an outsized impact. At the cost of just one instructional coach, we're able to reach 4 times the number of teachers. So what are we asking for from you? Teachers, tomorrow when you go into school, take out your smartphone and film yourself, and then watch it, and you're gonna hate it. And then do it again, and begin to normalize this process of seeing what's going really well and where can you improve. And if you want to do this in a supportive environment, please consider joining us. Our application for next fall is now live. And for all of our non-teacher friends in the audience tonight, please help us to continue the mission of normalizing video as a reflective tool for teachers who are the leaders, who are professionals, and who are experts in their classroom and community.
So Jen started us off with a view of classrooms where kids are free to be themselves, to learn and grow, to make mistakes, to get feedback from a teacher that's going to help them move their learning forward. We now know that across the city of Boston, we have not created these conditions on a consistent basis for teachers. So let's change this dynamic. Let's empower teachers to do it themselves, and let's see the heights this model of coaching can take our teachers, but most importantly, our students too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all, remember 5-paragraph essays? Yeah, do you have like strong feelings about them? Okay, so you're not alone, because our next speaker also has some pretty strong feelings about 5-paragraph essays. Her name is Mary Diebinga, and she teaches English at Boston Latin Academy, and I've been told that some of her students are in the audience, which is pretty cool, so shout out to them. So she does have some strong feelings about 5-paragraph essays, but she also has some advice for us on how we might revise the way we teach writing to help our students write stronger essays.
When I talk about being an English teacher, what I love to tell people is how in my job, what I really enjoy is that I get to help students to find their voice and express themselves in writing. Except that in the lived experience of a 10th grade English classroom, that doesn't really feel like what I get to do most of the time. What we really have to work on in 10th grade English is the essay. And it's important work that we do. This is the currency of the academic future that they're going to have in college. Students need to master this form in order to be able to excel. And as Lisa Delpit reminds us, this is particularly important for our most marginalized students. So we know it's important, but we also know that it's a really unnatural form for students. Teachers themselves talk about how esoteric it is. So the way that we get students through this thing is by lots of teacher intervention. We give students a prompt so they know what to write about. And then after that, we give them an outline so that they can organize the ideas. From there, we help them through the revision process with lots of feedback from the teacher. And when I lead students through this, from the prompt, through the outline, through the revisions, by the time I'm done, I feel like I've written the essay. And what's worse is it's not even a good essay. I am leading my students to mediocrity. And it seems like that's just the way it is. So, but I also have another experience of looking at these essays, because every time I have a pile of grading to do, I have a pile of essays that's mostly mediocre, but there's always a few that aren't. There are always a few essays that have an interesting take on the world in the way that they've written about a book, or they have a voice that's really strong. And it seems like, well, maybe these are just the students who really get it, and we get really excited about this. This student really did my assignment well. But if I'm honest with myself, what I really notice about these is these aren't the students who did my assignment well. They're responding to a different task. These are students who found their own interest in exploring an idea that's theirs, not my forms. Had they followed me, they would have ended up with the same mediocre essay. So is it just a couple of outliers who get it? Are these the really brilliant English students? What I really notice about it, though, is that that pile looks kind of the same no matter whether I'm teaching 9th grade remedial classes or AP literature in 12th grade. It's not really about sort of their academic success. In fact, I sometimes find that the more academically successful students are less willing to break out of the mold because they're more conscious of their grade. The way that I find with these students was like, what this was for me was an epiphany that students can do better or do something more. So what if I just demanded it? What if I just said I'm not going to accept mediocrity? So I experimented with it in my classroom, and I thought I was doing really well until in walked Carisha. Literally walked in for a writing conference, except that I realized pretty quickly that this wasn't so much a conference as a confrontation. She was not happy with the grade that I had given her on her essay, and she wanted an explanation, or really, she wanted me to change the grade. But she wanted first for me to explain it. And she told me very quickly that she had done everything on that rubric, that her essay had all of the components, and I agreed with her that she had responded to the prompt, which was about friendship, by showing me this relationship between two men and of mice and men, and how the men stood up for each other and stayed together and were always together. The perfect 3 examples essay that you typically teach students to write. And I told her that this was pretty good, but that her essay failed to mention that by the end of that book, one of the men kills the other. This tested the limits of her patience, and she just said, well, of course I know that, but it didn't fit her topic, so she didn't bother to mention it. And this was the problem with the task. This was a problem where there wasn't anywhere in the boxes that I was giving her for the thoughts that needed to happen about that book. And there wasn't any place in the prompt that told her that she needed to go beyond that. And Carisha, so I pushed her a little bit on this, and I said, let's try to think about it. But she was very rigid, and she couldn't get out of that type of thinking. And she's not alone in that. Gottschalk and Yortshoy, who are college researchers looking at college writers, noticed the same phenomenon, and they said that we should really think of writing as sort of a substance that you mold and shape, but that is a substance sort of like cement that after a point sets. And once it's set, trying to get a student to go back in and change that and make revisions takes something on the order of dynamite. And that's what I was doing with Carisha. She was done with her essay, and here I was trying to blow it apart and telling her to start over again. It just seemed patently unfair. And there was nothing in my experience in learning to be a teacher that had taught me how to deal with this. There was no strategy that I had. In fact, the only space that gave me a strategy for this was not my classroom experience, but my work as a debate coach. In debate, I had started off as a volunteer, taking on a debate team for a large urban high school in Boston, bringing students who were really poorly prepared into debates that I didn't actually even understand all of myself. Policy debate is very complicated. I would bring these students to these tournaments and throw them into rounds where they would talk about topics like the efficacy of efficacy of block grants to impact health outcomes, or talk about hegemonic soft power in Asia, teen stuff. And I'd hand them 300-page evidence packets at college-level reading, And I'd sit nervously in the background taking notes of things that we should probably work on next practice. And as they talked, my laundry list grew longer and longer and longer to a point where we never would have been able to address all of those things. But I'd watch these students, and in the beginning of the round, they were pretty much a mess, and they were reading arguments that they didn't really understand and couldn't really talk about effectively. But I noticed that as they continued talking, those ideas were changing. And I'd noticed that as the other team asked them questions and they responded, that revised their argument a little bit. And then as they got up to get into that next speech, it had developed a little bit more. And then they thought of something in response to the other thing. And by the end of the round, that same argument they were making was far more developed and was refined into something just much more sophisticated. And then they would walk immediately into the next round of the tournament, tear all those arguments down, and reconstruct them on the opposite side. And I would sit there just completely spellbound as I watched, and that laundry list of things that I had written down, half of them they would have fixed before they finished the tournament without a single word from me. I realized very quickly, debate is a better teacher than I am. And what I realized with that, though, is that what was going on was debate was teaching them to actually understand revision and to see their ideas as something that was moldable and flexible and something that they could enjoy the process of playing with. And that's what gave me the confidence in my conference with Carisha to know that we could get to a different place. So I pushed her off the paper and back into the ideas. And as we talked around to it, she was very resistant at first, sat there tight-lipped and patiently waiting for me to get off of this topic. And every time she would say, well, okay, is that what you want in the box? Well, okay, is that what you want? Okay, is that what you... And I pushed her until finally she sort of broke free of that. And she had this moment where she just had this realization, and she said, well, maybe it's not about what happened in the friendship before the killing. Maybe it had something to do with after. And she came up with this idea suddenly where she said, I think that really in this essay, what's important that it's saying about, in the book, what it's importantly saying about friendship is that without friendship, they couldn't have this dream. And then once the friendship was gone, life wasn't worth living. I was floored. And the other part about it was that she didn't need me anymore after that point. As soon as she had that idea, she was off writing that essay. And she was writing it not to get a page limit, but to get to the power of the idea. She wanted to express it to the fullness that it could be. And it's something from there that I was able to transfer into working with other students. Not in a one-on-one teacher conference way, but in encouraging student-to-student discourse. I worked with other teachers in the Boston Debate League, and we developed strategies that we use in the classroom to have students develop thesis statements, not with heavy teacher intervention, by debating out ideas with each other. By taking a thesis statement, coming up with evidence, then tearing it down and rearranging the evidence and trying out a different way. And learning from each other in discourse communities that didn't just prepare them for what college was, but mimicked exactly what college professors do themselves. Their work was peer-reviewed. And as we worked on this, we as teachers grew too. Now we offer a summer grad class to encourage other teachers to join our work as well. And it's really Carisha that I keep in mind as I'm working on this and as I'm watching in my own instruction growing. And Carisha's words at the end of the year when she was working on her final portfolio for me, she wrote, I realized that once I sat and thought about my thesis, that my writing could be beautiful. And that's what I carry with me, because now finally in my English instruction, I actually feel like I can honestly say that what I love about being an English teacher is that I get to help students to their beautiful, owned, personal, academic ideas. Thank you.
I told you they were good, right? Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. First, we're gonna give another round of applause to those amazing teachers. And second, we're going to do what good teachers do. Good teachers know that we can't throw a bunch of new stuff at kids and expect them to just like make sense of it right away. So we're going to give you a little break. You need to go out there, get some food, process and talk so that your brains don't explode with all of this wonderful brilliance. And then we're going to come back together and we're going to hear even more wonderful brilliance, and maybe your brains will explode. So before you go, I need the speakers to meet stage right so we can do a little microphone magic, and we'll see you out there. Welcome back. Okay, so I have two things to say to you. One, you're a really awesome audience. I just want to put that out there. Yeah. You're like so supportive. I can tell you're really engaged, so keep it up. Two, here's another thing to do with all of your engagement. Use that hashtag. So when you hear them say something really brilliant, go ahead and tweet it out, a hashtag Boston EdTalks, so the rest of the world can feel really jealous that they're not here, okay? All right, so before we get started, I want to talk to you a little bit about this idea that a woman named Emily Stile, she was a teacher leader, she wrote this essay in the late 1980s. And she introduced this metaphor of windows and mirrors as a way that teachers could sort of think about and analyze our curricula and think about the different ways that our students might be experiencing our curricula. So she basically said, okay, look, windows are places in our curricula where our students are able to see through and see and understand somebody else's perspective. They get to learn about somebody's lived experience that's not their own. And that's really important. And mirrors are places in our curricula where our kids see themselves. They see their own lived experiences. And that's really important too. But too often, especially our kids of color, they're seeing way too many windows and not enough mirrors. So this has become a way for teachers to really think about, are we honoring all of our kids? Are we giving all of our kids access to windows and mirrors in our classrooms and our schools? So I've been thinking about this recently because my year of traveling is sort of wrapping up. And I've had tons and tons of experiences looking through windows this year. So I've gone to all of these different places, and I've seen all of these different things that are different from what I know and who I am as a teacher and as a person. But the thing that's really surprised me as I've been all over the place is the number of mirrors that I've been able to look into in the most unlikely places for me. So in Middle America, in rural Texas, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, I found myself looking into mirrors and seeing that teaching and learning look really, really similar no matter where we are. And that the things that are at the heart of what we do as teachers are really, really similar no matter where we are. So I want to invite you in this second half of the Ed Talks to use that as a lens to think about and to hear some of these stories that our speakers are going to tell you. Okay, think about when are they offering you windows into someone else's world, into someone else's perspective? And when are they holding up mirrors for you? When is something resonating deeply with you in terms of what you know and what you've experienced? And then tweet it out using the hashtag Boston EdTalks. Okay, so are you ready? Yeah? Okay. Here to kick off the second half of the 7th Annual Boston EdTalks here at WGBH is Michelle Ciccone. Michelle is a technology integration coordinator at Krista McAuliffe Charter School in Framingham. Yeah? Okay. And she's here to take us on a journey of an internet education, one that shifts the focus from students' online etiquette to engaging them authentically in digital conversation.
The internet is a powerful tool, but not everyone that uses the internet uses it powerfully. So how do we get there? In my work and in my travels, I've learned that the most pervasive educational approach that schools take to preparing young people to be better users of the internet is what's called digital citizenship. And the first time I heard that, I was really excited because that sounds really powerful, right? Digital citizenship. But as I got to understand how schools enact digital citizenship education, I started to see that it's very often watered down. It becomes this conversation about etiquette and a list of do's and don'ts. It seems like the underlying theory behind digital citizenship education is that the internet works best when its users are polite and kind to each other. which I guess isn't untrue, right? But is that the full story? Are those who use the internet most powerfully those who follow this list of do's and don'ts? I didn't think so, and so I set out to uncover a better way of preparing young people for digital engagement. And I thought, if I want young people to use the internet more expertly, I needed to become an expert. I needed to learn about the internet. So I set out. I attended conferences. I read widely. I talked to experts in the field. To be honest, I had a lot to learn because I am no techie. I was an English major in college, and I'm still most content reading a 19th century novel by Dostoevsky. And sure, I got really good at AOL Instant Messaging, but that was kind of the extent of it. And at first, that felt like a real disadvantage, this non-tech background and working in ed tech. But I now see it as an advantage, actually, because if we're inviting more and more technology into the classroom and asking young people to use technology to create and analyze and learn and think, it's actually good to have people in on the conversation that are not techno-evangelists. So I set out to learn about the internet, and I learned a lot. And as I learned about the internet, this one uncomfortable truth kept coming to the surface, that the way that the internet works, it's not been built to bring out the best in its users. And in fact, it's been built to prey on our weaknesses. You know, we users of the internet don't even have a lot of control over the content that we see. Algorithms are constantly trying to predict what we want to see. And the websites and apps that have created these algorithms have a distinct motivation to try to get us to want to see certain things. Websites, they want our attention, they want our engagement, and they've discovered that the best way to get us engaged and interested is to make us afraid and put things in front of us that make us angry. In a lot of ways, the more I learned about the internet, the more powerless I felt. And you know, this has been in the news a lot more lately. People are starting to learn about how the internet works, and people aren't happy with what they learn about. But this has not trickled down to the way that the internet is talked about in schools. There is still this emphasis on etiquette, on do's and don'ts. But I think that there's a better way. I think if we want the internet to be this powerful place, we need to empower its users. And the best way to empower is to teach how this thing works. And I think we as teachers, a lot of the time, we feel like the young people, the students that come into our classroom, they're the experts. What can we teach them about technology? And sure, young people are really good at using the internet for entertainment, but for purpose, not yet. And at one point in education, it was this revolutionary idea to say that every teacher's a reading teacher. And then every teacher's a writing teacher. Well, I think that every teacher's a digital citizenship teacher, but a different kind of digital citizenship. So what do I mean? My job is to develop curriculum to engage young people in these conversations, and I work with middle schoolers every day. And I've discovered that there's 3 essential components to this new type of digital citizenship education, and I want to share them with you tonight. Component number 1, we need to encourage digital engagement in young people and then let them practice in our classrooms. And I know that sounds kind of scary. It sounds like maybe that's inviting chaos or even danger into the classroom. But here's the thing, today, if you don't have an online presence, that's suspicious. And if we want young people to have this positive, professional, powerful presence online, we have to help them develop that. So teachers, start with one classroom conversation. Take a topic that you know engages a lot of interest in your students and move it online. Choose something controversial and let your students practice having thoughtful and evidence-based conversations with each other online. I'm constantly surprised and very happy with the high caliber of the conversation I have in my classroom when I do this. But as sure as I am it's gonna go well in your classroom, I'm also sure something's gonna go wrong. Suddenly, magically, before your eyes, one of your students will transform into a troll. And they're gonna start posting silly memes and inappropriate comments and a joke. But there's this wonderful moment when the rest of the students in your class turn physically to face that troll and say, hey, stop trolling. And when else can a troll get that sort of face-to-face feedback? Component number 2, start from a positive place. Now, I know because when young people interact with each other online, things can go wrong, and that's scary. And so our gut response is to speak to them in that fear. Don't say that online, don't do that. But we really have to move on from that conversation. Because if you've ever worked with teenagers or been a teenager yourself, you know that teenagers do not want to be scared into submission. It just doesn't work. So instead, if you want young people to engage in more positive and productive spaces online, have them create them. Have your students design and prototype a better social media app. Ask them, what problem would they solve? Get them thinking like the ethical developers that we really need, and they will. And component number 3, recognize that young people are already critical users of new technologies. In fact, I would say the middle schoolers in my classrooms are more cynical about new technology developments than the adults in my life are. We can tap into that cynicism and then turn it into power. For example, if we want young people to care more about the privacy of their information, if we want them to hold a little bit closer certain details about their life and their activities, teach them about cookies. You know, cookies, that little piece of code that websites and apps install into your browser that you just sort of blindly agree to when you check that I agree box to the terms of service that you didn't actually read and you have no idea what's in there. Cookies that are collecting information on our activity across these websites and apps, and then use that to customize our experience online. But then these websites also are able to turn around and sell that information to ad networks and other companies. If you teach users about cookies, I guarantee you're going to get users more interested in what's in those terms of service. I know because I see it in my classroom every day. So, my message to you tonight is, do not despair. The internet can be that powerful place we've always wanted it to be, and the young people in our lives are going to help us get there. They already see what's wrong with the tools that we've developed. They just need a little bit of practice and some help peeking behind the screen. Thank you.
All right, next up, we have a power trio hailing from KIPP. All right, so we've got, KIPP is in the house. We've got Hugo Carvajal. He's the Director of Family and Community Engagement at KIPP, Massachusetts. Mecca Smith is the Chief of Staff at KIPP, Massachusetts, and has a really big fan club. And Patricia Ann McCaffrey is a Learning Specialist at KIPP Academy Lynn. And they've got some really big ideas about how schools might re-envision family engagement, starting with one really simple step: listening.
Picture this. Esther is sitting in class. She's waiting to get back the first test of the spring. She studied with her family because in the fall she didn't pass. She really wanted to do well. She gets back her test, and she mastered a majority of the standards with an 85%. In addition to being an adult ESOL learner, Esther is a proud mother of 2 4th graders and 1 7th grader. Engaging Esther in ESOL classes is one way where we can broaden the definition of family engagement.
While many would agree that family engagement and building relationships is critical for younger students, engagement can actually transcend a child's classroom walls. When a school commits to educating and also engaging families, it really strengthens networks in and outside of its building. For instance, Esther gains English language proficiency skills and confidence in her ability to communicate with native English speakers when she takes ESOL classes at her child's school.
Many of our families and community members, like Esther, identify as people of color and grew up experiencing some of the unjust rules and regulations designed to keep them impoverished and uninformed. Cynthia, another friend from the community, as a child experienced forced busing in Boston, and she saw her father unable to get a loan to buy a home where he wanted, in spite of dedicating his life to the police department due to redlining practices. Trust in our systems, including education, has been severely damaged for educationally underserved communities. Studies have shown that systematically, marginalized families are often pushed out of parent-teacher associations. This widens the collaboration gap between families and teachers. At times, schools welcome family engagement, but only look at challenges, situations, and solutions from the school's perspective. It is our belief that the school has the responsibility and opportunity to value and engage families' voices.
The main problem we are seeing in communities of color in and around Boston, such as where Esther and Cynthia live, is that too often decisions about defining engagement are made divorced from the input of the very people they impact, the family and community members themselves. About 10 years ago, we started hosting a series of culture nights at our school during Latino Heritage Month and Black History Month because we wanted to celebrate our students' backgrounds. We assumed that by providing plenty of pizza and pastelitos, that was going to be enough to keep our families happy. But it wasn't. It really wasn't. We were shocked to find out that some families decided not to attend at all. And even those who came, they weren't necessarily enthralled by a meticulous planning process. So we had to figure out what was going on. We decided to ask our families directly, and we started to survey them. We had to figure out exactly what they really wanted and needed from us. How would they define family engagement?
Turns out they wanted to see more local community organizations directly involved with the school. They wanted us to be part of the solution of providing ESOL classes to our families. They wanted us to keep the lights on after 5 p.m. when children left the school so they could have meetings. They were asking for more than just culture nights. This basic practice of seeking input respectfully from families positively influenced collaboration between families and teachers, and within the family unit between parent and child, for everyone had a purpose at school.
And different communities will want or need different things. For instance, our communities in Lynn, our families really wanted ESOL classes, whereas our families in Boston, they really wanted civic engagement classes so they can activate their knowledge and really make a difference in their neighborhoods. Therefore, we asked what they wanted and made our programs accordingly.
Remember Cynthia? As a housing activist, she's been involved in local organizations for years, way before our school even existed. Once we responded to family feedback and really doubled down on strengthening our community partnerships, we were open to a whole world of Cynthias, who also shared our vision for building up strong community schools. Since then, Cynthia has been to our school and she's talked with hundreds of our middle school students about her personal story. She shared her experiences as a child and her relationships to schools, how she learned about systems, and how her community ties have all influenced her activism. Cynthia's grandchild currently attends our school.
And Esther has shared with us that by participating in ESOL classes and civic engagement, she has not only increased her language proficiency, but also her ability and confidence to navigate the systems and understand the culture of her adopted country. She has also strengthened her social networks and her capacity to advocate for her children's education, and she wants to help other families by raising awareness around the inequities that English language learning families can face.
As a community learning teacher, I have the ability to make relationships with families that I would not have made before. For example, one of my 6th graders, he wasn't following expectations in class, so he earned a consequence. And then I had to have a conversation with his father that he, the star player of the soccer team, was not going to be playing in that day's game. A conversation that could have gone pretty poorly. However, I was able to utilize the relationship that I had made through this ESOL classes and jokingly to say to him, you know, you and your son are pretty similar. You both don't like to listen to the teacher when they're giving instructions. Yeah, he laughed just like you did. And then I was then able to explain to him in more depth and detail of what the situation really happened. And then he was able at the end to say, thank you so much for holding us both to such high expectations. This is just one way of how broadening the definition of family engagement can leak into the traditional school day. It is our belief that the school has a responsibility and opportunity to value and engage families' voices.
Patricia Ann would not have been able to form that relationship with the parent if the school had not first created the spaces to listen to our families. We need to find out what families want, need, and have to offer. We need to work with community leaders, faith congregations, parent leaders, even local government to advocate for disenfranchised families to truly have a seat at the table at school and outside of school. Many of our families and community members have asked us for citizenship classes, computer classes, and programs to build their capacity and employability skills, and they've supported those programs. Without them, they could not have been happening. Many families have also participated in voting drives, and they know that without voting power, politicians are not going to pay attention. Over the past decade, hundreds of participants have become U.S. citizens, and over 4,000 have taken ESOL classes in our programs. When schools are open to true collaboration with families and community members, parallel learning experiences can thrive.
When I think of this, I imagine how schools should really be the hub of a community's life, right? They should be places where families can gather, engage with one another, advocate and develop those types of skills, not just for the benefit of the school, but to incite community-wide change. We've seen some examples of this through our own programs, and we're really proud of that. But we also recognize that what we offer isn't perfect, nor is it all-encompassing. For that reason, we are constantly asking feedback from our families and community members to better understand what it is that they're truly seeking. We still give a version of that initial survey we started 10 years ago every year to keep a constant pulse on what's truly on the minds and hearts of our families and community members. It is our belief that the school has a responsibility and an opportunity to value and engage the voices of our families.
And we also recognize that not all schools have the ability to and resources to provide things like we have for Esther and for Cynthia. However, we still have the responsibility to increase our family's social capital. And doing so is actually a lot easier where you know where to look, the resources you already have. 10 years ago, when we were just starting this program, we reallocated Title I funds and put it towards family and community engagement. And then we needed a nighttime staff. So we looked at the staff that we already had and utilized that as a perfect opportunity to show that a community active professional is a symbiotic relationship between the school and the community. We also realized that that is too much for some schools too. So listen up if that's you. If that's you, then just open up your schools after hours and invite in the community organizations that are already there. Ask if they need to hold town hall meetings. Ask if your families need to know the organizations that already occur. Create a list. Give them to your families. Because, put simply, if your families and teachers do not know about organizations, how can they utilize them?
This is the exact type of questions that schools should be wrestling with. We're all educators, and we recognize the role that engagement plays in developing relationships between students and families in schools. And for true engagement to happen, everyone has to have the opportunity to share their perspective. So we're not just talking about us inviting others to have a seat at the table. No. Together, we all pull up chairs and set the table. We all reach across, and we bridge those collaboration gaps, whether they be real or perceived, historic or embodied by a student sitting right in front of you.
More Esthers and Cynthias occur every single day.
It is our belief that the school has the responsibility and opportunity to value and engage families' voices.
What do you believe that our families and communities have to contribute? Thank you.
Thank you.
Regine Celius is a 5th grade teacher at the Epiphany School in Dorchester. And she knows that the heart of a teacher's work can't be found in a textbook, and it can't be found in a grade book. The heart of a teacher's work is centered in her relationships with her students.
It's complicated. No, I'm not talking about my relationship status. I'm referring to all of the ways we engage students with trauma. I'm talking about how often these students have to play the fence when navigating their experiences in both a healthy and meaningful way. In fact, nearly 30% of students at my school had faced adverse childhood experiences, and nearly 40% of students across Boston share that commonality. The most important piece, the most important similarity that all of these students share is resilience. So why don't we focus on that as much? Let me tell you about Dina. It's hard to miss Dina in the morning. She'll make her way into the copy room and strike up a conversation with a teacher who's preparing for their class the next day. Then she'll make her way into a classroom and at the top of her lungs scream her morning greetings to another teacher. From there, she goes into the lobby and she finds a teacher to roast with a joke that she probably spent all morning trying to prepare. Once Dina is done disturbing the peace that once existed before the 7:15 bell, she'll make her way into our classroom. There, she'll water the plants, she'll turn on the soft lights, she'll turn on the music, she'll lay out the classroom supplies, because she has tasked herself with the responsibility of establishing a calm space for her peers to come into. Dina cares deeply about our school. That wasn't always the case, though. Like many students, Dina came to us with great hesitation and a natural mistrust. Dina's an amalgam of dozens of students I've taught, hundreds of students that's come through our school, and thousands of students across Boston. So why trauma sensitivity? Without trauma sensitivity, we miss out on the opportunity to learn about Dina's experiences. She came to us with the understanding that she was a challenging student. So she had both self-induced labels and also projected labels that the classroom just wasn't for her. In my experience, recently I've been struggling with how we label students like Dina, specifically girls of color. I found that in absence of trauma sensitivity, we often forget their experiences. We often forget all of the things that make them who they are. So when we see the challenging behaviors, we often, we go as far as to say that they're aggressive, or we use language, problematic language that minimalize their experiences and their voice. I'm thinking of students like Dina who have the most beautiful ways of advocating for their needs and the needs of others. And all of the experiences that they've had that have taught them how to advocate are often dismissed because we ask them to silence that piece of them. Also, what we often do with traumatized students or students who've had traumatizing experiences is we either placate or we dismiss them. We placate when we place their experiences above them, therefore establishing low expectations or justifying poor behavior. We dismiss our students when we set our standards higher than the student themselves and effectively disrespect them and all of the things that make them who they are. I too have played on both sides of the fence. I have been in spaces where I didn't take the time to hear what it was my student was trying to convey to me. Oftentimes, I would see the challenging behavior and just, immediately react as a teacher and use some of the strategies I learned in my teacher prep program and respond or follow the systems that we had in place and miss out on the opportunity to engage with that child in a meaningful way. And what I would do in those instances is I would miss out on an opportunity to hear their side of the story, to hear where they're coming from, or why that they see their challenges for what they are. Well, I've learned many strategies since working at my school about creating an environment for trauma sensitivity. We do a great job of making sure our classrooms feel like home. So we use strategies like meditation, we'll use strategies, break systems, we'll use opportunities for students to take more of a leadership role. But the most important piece about trauma sensitivity is the collaborative problem-solving piece. What I learned while engaging with my students is that instead of me immediately making assumptions about their challenges, why not sit and process with them? Give them the opportunity to give me some insight on why they're struggling. One of the most beautiful places I love in my school is probably not the most regulated space. It's known as the Student Reflection Area. There, it's an opportunity for students who struggle with challenging behaviors in class to go and take space. It's not a perfect system, but it's an opportunity for students to, one, accept responsibility for their actions, but then also to have a conversation with a teacher whom they probably already have a relationship with and discuss all of the ways that they can get back on track. It goes back to that idea of placating and dismissing. If we can find a system where we can hold our students accountable, but yet still love them and hear them out and collaboratively problem solve with them, imagine what we could do for them and their stories. It's complicated. And it will continue to be complicated for a while. It's a process, but through it all, what we all as educators need to remember is that our students, especially our students who have experienced trauma, especially our girls of color, what they need is they need to be dignified. And the ways that they can be dignified is if you stop and you listen to them and you engage them in on all the ways that they can problem solve through their challenges. We love our students. We want the best for them. So let's think about the ways that we can establish systems in our own environments to help these students who are struggling. Thank you.
All right, teachers, let's be honest. I want you to raise your hand if you have ever carefully planned a lesson only to have it go utterly and completely wrong. That's right. All right, me too. So we're in luck because our next speaker, Alvaro Peters, who teaches speech and composition at KIPP Academy Lynn Collegiate, has also experienced this. And he's going to tell us about how a classroom activity gone awry completely changed the way that he talks to his students about oppression and liberation.
Educators, let's be honest for a moment. How many times have you recited the phrase and pleaded with our young people to be the change you wish to see in the world? Now, how many times have you given them any tools to actualize on this noble promise? Well, it doesn't help that our antiquated education system teaches our young people how to live in this world, but not how to change it. Naturally, as a 9th grade teacher, I think a lot about this dilemma. I think about how to shock our students into becoming change agents. And myself, like I'm sure a lot of you in the audience tonight, spend a lot of time trying to get our students' heads out of their cell phones and into the world. And I don't know about y'all, but if I see one more flower tiara or a doggy-eared Snapchat filter, I might just lose my mind. So, in the beginning of the year, I did what most well-meaning, social justice-driven teachers would do, and we did the privilege walk. See, my hope was to showcase to my students the invisible and, to be honest, unearned disadvantages they have simply by being a minoritized person in our world. So, one brisk December morning, I wrangled about 121 of my students, around 20 staff members, and we went outside to do the walk. So As soon as they were lined up side by side, I began to read the statements aloud. Take a step forward if one of your parents has attended college. Up stepped a few of my students, and a handful more, and then a couple more. I thought to myself, that's interesting. Okay. Take a step forward if at least one of your parents owns a business. And yet, a few more students stepped forward. And see, at this point in time, my plan began to crumble before my eyes. So, I said another statement. Take a step backwards if your race can be used against you to explain your faults. Not a student of color moved. I'm guessing they didn't hear me. Take a step backwards if your race is used against you to justify or explain your faults. One or two students pitied me, I guess, and stepped backwards. And see, by the end of the walk, around 20 or 30 minutes later, what you had was a handful of my students of color ahead of the white staff members. Yeah. And see, this never happens. Y'all laughing because it never happens. And so in my head, I thought, damn, okay, what am I going to do? I realized that my plan was now down the drain. But see, mama didn't raise no punk, and I wasn't going out without a fight. It wasn't that simple. I realized that I could quickly figure out the situation if I thought about it. Now, on our way back to my class, did I figure it out? Absolutely not. But I realized I could use this experience as a data point to shift my curriculum. So by the time we got back to my classroom, I asked a couple of debrief questions, and I got real serious. Explain to me why none of you students moved backwards about that question on race and how it can be used against you. Raymond, in the back, of course, raised his hand. Well, what about Obama? He was the president, and he's black. Sadly, prior to taking my class, a number of my students, including a lot of the country, if we're frank, believed that racism ended with Obama's election. Yep, that he simply wiped it out with his radiant smile and silky smooth voice. That it just vanished like that overnight. Sort of like the money I used to stash in my underwear drawer as a child. Yeah, you remember that, Pops? Mm-hmm. So, this is to say that many of them couldn't quite figure it out. Like, how do these systems of oppression exist when our country elected a black man as our leader? It was going to be a rude awakening for many of them. Next question. How did y'all make sense of the fact that students of color were ahead of all of our white staff members? This time, Brianna's hand shot up. Well, Mr. Peters, times are different. Our parents, more of them are going to college, and they're working very hard to give us what we have. So it's easier for us. And I was blown, speechless by this statement, but a little conflicted because shouldn't we be celebrating the fact that our communities of color have some type of palpable progress? I mean, if we're honest, our lives are infinitely easier than our ancestors. But what about police brutality, the wage gap, prison industrial complex? No. Our lives aren't going to be simply easy for us. But if that's what our students are picking up, then we got a problem. Because our schools simply will not shield them on their way home. Their diplomas don't double as some type of indestructible bulletproof vest. So to our black and brown youth, the idea that it's easier for us is simply setting them up with a life-threatening false sense of security. Now, if that's the case, what do we do about this? Do we teach them about these systems or pretend they don't exist? In my opinion, silence is violence. Now, I also understand that even though silence is violence, a lot of us adults in the audience, we choose very deliberately to withhold this information from our children in hopes of crystallizing the hope that they have. And I get that, sort of. But on the other side, at worst, we begin to perpetuate the same systems and circumstances that have plagued our communities for centuries. So I ask you tonight, which will it be? Option A, allow them to be blindsided by a system that is bent on their destruction, Or option B, teach them how to recognize and navigate these systems so that they have a fighting chance. Audre Lorde explains to us that, quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And using her words as our North Star, we must provide our young ones with the knowledge of systems, or KOS for short, to reveal the man behind the curtain, so to say, like on that classic scene of Wizard of Oz. Y'all remember that? The entire film, we thought the wizard was some indestructible superior being, only to find out that he was my size. Yeah, it's true. And see, I'm not trying to say that political revolution and restructuring will be easy. But remember this. Systems are comprised of human beings, much like you and I. And therefore, they can be manipulated and infiltrated to benefit us for once. Now, luckily, I've had the pleasure of teaching a strictly social justice course at KIPP Academy, Lynn. And over there, we call it speech and comp. Mm-hmm. And if I'm being honest with you, being the bearer of bad news, the person to tell them that oppression is real and it's undeniably omnipotent, right? And that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention, has been a lot like telling precious little infants that Santa Claus doesn't exist. And I apologize if I ruined Christmas for some of y'all. Still got some babies in here, some young ones. But see, anyways, back to the point. Creating this curriculum from scratch wasn't an easy task, if I'm being 100% honest, but it was worth it because I am certain that I exposed them to some of those systems that seemingly control our lives. And I want to share with you a couple of highlights. At the beginning of the year, we started off with the power of self-identification through original spoken word. After that, we moved on to the 4 I's of oppression and critical consciousness. We then tackled race and racism from both the scientific and a sort of historic perspective. And then we tackled cultural hegemony, white privilege, white fragility, gender and sexuality, and boy, that one was rough. Mm-hmm. And then we'll soon go on to tackle prison-industrial complex, food industry, and immigration. Now, in the audience, you're probably thinking one or two things. The first, boy, that Mr. Peters is boring. Fair. Or two, okay, they have these fancy tools and terms and theories, but what do they actually do with it all? I'll answer the second part. We'll get into the first one. If you know anything about critical consciousness, you realize that there is a crucial non-negotiable, essentially linking theory to practice, the sort of so what, now what, if you will. And I think that one of the ways they're able to practice this KOS is when we pause to get privy. In other words, we pause our curriculum to get privy, knowledgeable, hip, of what's going on in the world around them. All right, from police brutality, school shootings, the resurgence of the slave trade in Liberia, our students have the space to use their KOS as a lens to interpret the world. And considering that KIPP is comprised of a lot of immigrant families, I think perhaps one of the most effective and memorable KOS moments is when I had each and every single one of my students call up congresswomen and congressmen to support the maintenance of DACA. Months later, I had them all write individualized letters to Speaker DeLeo and Governor Baker, and then we followed up by participating in the Children's March at the State House. And see, all this and more becomes possible, but only if schools adopt the KOS philosophy. Perhaps not in a required core course like speech and comp, which is my suggestion here, but truthfully, pausing to get privy, that's undeniably and universally adaptable, be you the STEM, humanities, or the arts. So what I would like you to do next time an injustice rolls across your news feed or your newspaper, because I know some of y'all still do that out here, I want you to do two things. One, recognize that your students aren't blind and they have opinions that matter. Two, print out an article or two, hand it to your students, have them read and discuss. Mind-blowing, right? Tell me about it. Now, this is all to say that if our schools do not teach KOS in some shape, form, or fashion, then we are failing our future. We know that right now, our society is in desperate need of capable, fearless leaders that have a deep sense of moral conviction. And as a result, our schools must become that training ground to arm them with the chaos needed to go out into the world and combat and confront oppression on the front lines. I'm talking about the fight of their lives. Will you be that training ground? Educators in the audience, realize that every day you wake up, you have an option. Will you reject the realities that cripple and paralyze our hope? Will you refuse to normalize injustices? Will you provide them with the tools needed to dismantle the master's house? Because I'm certain if we do all these things, our children will go on to actually become the change we all wish to see in the world. Thank you.
We have heard so many beautiful stories tonight. And our final speaker is going to bring that all home for us. Christine Gentry is the Director of Teacher Development and Licensure at City on a Hill Charter Public Schools. And she believes in the power of listening to one another's stories, especially in the classroom, as a way to spark powerful change.
So teachers aren't generally drawn to the profession by the promise of great money, fame, and power. I mean, those people might exist, but they get real disappointed real quick. Every teacher I have ever met got into teaching because they care about kids. We all want our students to feel successful and cared for, but we also have to concern ourselves with things like covering massive amounts of content, meeting state standards, and preparing our kids for high-stakes tests and exams. So with the very best of intentions, we gather all the information we can about our students' academic lives. We track their grades, we track their participation, we give formative and summative assessments, we use that data to inform our instruction, we create early warning indicator spreadsheets that track how many classes a student is failing, how many absences they have, how many dean sends, detentions. And to be clear, I'm not saying that these are bad practices, right? Or that they have no place in school. I'm just trying to tell you that I sat in a meeting once to decide if a shy, struggling kid needed special education services. And about a week later, that kid showed up to school wearing sandbags strapped around his wrists. And he had them hidden under a long-sleeved t-shirt. And he walked over to another kid, and he started beating the crap out of him. He knew the sandbags would make him hit harder. And it turns out that that kid had been viciously bullying him every day after school for months, and none of us knew. Because too often, school emphasizes the academic over the personal. In my early years of teaching, I was at a public high school in Boston that required me to teach 10 novels and assign 12 literary analysis essays a year. Setting aside the time to get to know my kids just really didn't feel like an option. So I started doing journal entries with prompts connected to the content, because I did have time for that. And I found myself building relationships with my kids on the page. And then as they became more comfortable sharing those entries out loud, I saw them build relationships with each other. And then I got to teach a creative writing class where kids were crafting personal narratives. And I got to see that process turbocharged. Kids were working harder than I'd ever seen them work. They were producing better written products than anything I'd ever seen. And my relationships with them were deepening in ways I'd never experienced. The more I got to know my students, the harder they worked for me, the better they behaved. It was almost as if I were making deposits into some kind of interpersonal connection bank and then writing and cashing checks to get kids to achieve what I knew they were capable of, academically or behaviorally. I was banking on relationships. And what I've come to understand is that relationships are the currency of instruction. Students work harder for teachers they love. And you can't love someone that you don't know. And I can hear you saying, what are you asking me to do, lady? I do not have time. I got all this to cover, and my kids come in behind. Or as a school board member once said to me, relationships don't close opportunity gaps. But I believe that they can. And I also believe that if your students perceive you promoting things like test performance over things like interaction and mutual respect, that their motivation and engagement will decline. And that will negatively affect your instruction and their learning. Because if there's no personal connection to school, or worse, no motivation to go to school, then what good will dozens of essays do? And of course, academics are important. Of course they are. I'm not asking you to sacrifice the academic for the personal. I'm asking you to strengthen the academic with the personal. I'm asking you to value both. So how do you do that? How do you build the kinds of relationships with kids that will let you create safe learning environments where kids are authentically engaged and academically successful? You must allow yourself and your students to bear witness to each other's lives. And you can start doing that in small ways, like journal entries or personal narrative writing. But students don't tend to share their writing in very public ways, right? In my class, publication celebrations were students silently moving around the room, reading and commenting on each other's work. I have a former student here who remembers that. And it was beautiful, but it didn't really feel like bearing witness. And then in 2008, I fell in love with The Moth. Do you guys know it? It's a storytelling nonprofit, very simple premise. It's just people telling stories on stage, right? No notes, just them and the mic. And I will never forget the first time I put my name at a Moth Story Slam. I told a story about an end of a major relationship, and at the end, the host gave me a giant hug, and he gave me a swig of his whiskey. And at intermission, so many people came up to me to tell me they'd been through something similar, or just to assure me that I'd be okay. And on the subway ride home, I was just so moved. I was like, this is something. Like, this could be a way for my students to truly bear witness to each other, minus the whiskey. It's like, what if I explicitly taught my kids how to choose and craft stories from their lives, and then allowed them to publicly perform those stories? And so I hunted the people at the Moth Central office down, and I charmed them into letting me work for them. And then I eventually devoted my entire dissertation to exploring how storytelling can help kids navigate their identities and create stronger connections to each other and to us and to school. And I saw storytelling increase student motivation. I saw it decrease behavioral issues. I saw it create community between kids who'd never really interacted before. And I saw it help students make sense of the major events and relationships in their lives. I once had a 16-year-old basically write my entire dissertation for me when she said, "You know, Miss, the painful things that happen in our lives are the ones we have the most emotions about, right? And those emotions tend to get like jumbled and confused and twisted because we got a lot of them, and they don't know what to do with each other, so they're like vines, and they tangle in each other and they just freeze. And when you take that painful thing and you tell a story about it, it's like untangling those vines and laying them out. So that not only does it make sense to everyone else, but in the process it's making more sense to you." I was like, I'm not going to be able to come up with anything better than that. And I didn't. And another time, the teacher whose classroom I was working in said, "You know, I just find storytelling helps with everything. Like, I don't really have disciplinary issues after storytelling units. Like, once those students start showing themselves to each other, once that trust is built, I don't really have disciplinary issues. And if I do, they're small. They're teenager stuff, right? Not the big things that used to happen in class." And I need to be very clear with you tonight that storytelling is not a magic wand, right? The power of public, personal storytelling is, like all powerful things, double-edged, and it shouldn't be used lightly. You can't do this work without being prepared. I would argue without being trained to listen for trauma, to help kids untangle those vines, to help them decide whether going public with a story is safe, and to help them understand that we should tell stories from our scars and not our wounds. But I have seen that granting students the time and the space to bear witness to each other's lives can improve classroom community and student motivation in such powerful ways. And connected, motivated students with access to strong curriculum and instruction are academically successful. That is how relationships close opportunity gaps. I train teachers now. through a program called the Urban Teaching Fellowship. And I often tell my fellows, when you run into your former students on the T or at Target or on the street, and you will, they will never remember the grade that you gave them. And they won't remember half of the content that you taught them. But as Maya Angelou would say, they will absolutely remember what it felt like to be in your class. We can't separate who we are from what happens in our classrooms, and neither can our students. So our classrooms must be spaces where we can bring our most authentic selves. It is our responsibility as educators to bear witness to our students' lives and to create space for them to be each other's witnesses. Make room for the personal, and you'll see gains in the academic. Thank you.
Well, what an evening. If you have ever come to an Ed Talks before, you know that this is the portion of the evening where I say, this is the best Ed Talks we've ever had. But I have to tell you, this is the best Ed Talks we've ever had. So I have one job, which is to close us out with lots of thanks. So this is an appreciation event, and I would be remiss if I did not help the village or the tribe of people who have led tonight to be the success that I think it has been. And so I have a relatively long list, and after that list, I hope you'll stay for a short reception afterwards, but let me just offer my thanks first to our presenters. You did an amazing job. I know you'll agree that they have inspired us with their authenticity, their passion, their personalities came through, and I feel grateful to live in a community with educators like this working every day on behalf of children in Greater Boston. I would also like to thank our MC, Sydney Chaffee, who very graciously led us through tonight. Orlando Watkins for kicking off our evening with the welcome from the Boston Foundation. None of this would be possible without our coaching team, who was amazing. Laura Gassner-Oding in the back, Tamsin Webster up front. You pushed and you cheered and you supported and you taught and you just loved our presenters and wrapped them all in your wisdom and assistance, and it showed. It was amazing. And Gina Rasson, who also helped at coming in sort of midway through the process and helping them be on the stage and breathe and learn and do it. So thank you very much. It really does take a village, so I mentioned our teacher advisory board who came to every rehearsal and just gave feedback and input and really helped peer-to-peer our presenters with developing their talk. I would also like to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and WGBH for supporting us. And WGBH, Jenny Harton and Sandy Chin and our amazing AV crew, you were incredible. Thank you very much. You made us look good, you made us sound good, so that's a lot of it. We had support from the Team TBF, including Julia Campbell, our social media consultant, Ted McEnroe, Sandy Kendall, Kate Canfield, program design, social media, everything. So that's sort of the back office. And including in the back office, Lauren Baker and Michelle Hinkle, who made the ops work, Richard Howard, who has taken photos of us and made us look good, Baker's Best for the delicious food. And of course, the education team at the Boston Foundation, Erica Steves, Antonia Marinova, John Griffin, and Heather Buffo, who wrote this list but left herself off of it. Heather kept the trains running, and if tonight worked, at the end of the day, it really is because Heather made it work. So thank you very much, Heather. Okay, I'm coming to the end, I promise. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. As we end, I have more asks for you. It wasn't just about the tweeting. First, because tonight is sharing stories, if you heard something that inspired you, I ask that you please tell someone about it. You can tweet about it, you can put it on Instagram, but even better, tomorrow, tell someone about something you heard today. That will keep this going. We want people to know about the wonderful work happening in schools, so help us spread the word. And speaking of spreading the word, when we put out applications for next year's Ed Talks in the fall, please encourage amazing teachers that you know to apply. We'll be back next year in May for Teacher Appreciation Week, and you can read all about it at bostonedtalks.org. So enjoy your evening. Please enjoy some desserts and a beverage, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.